Section 5 of the Conjure Woman. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James K. White. Section 5 of the Conjure Woman by Charles Waddell Chesnutt. Sis Becky's Pickaninny. We had not lived in North Carolina very long before I was able to note a marked improvement in my wife's health. The ozone-laden air of the surrounding piney woods, the mild and equable climate, the peaceful leisure of country life, had brought about in hopeful measure the cure we had anticipated. Toward the end of our second year, however, her ailment took an unexpected turn for the worse. She became the victim of a settled melancholy, attended with vague forebodings of impending misfortune. "You must keep up her spirits," said our physician, the best in the neighboring town. "This melancholy lowers her tone too much, tends to lessen her strength, and, if it continue too long, may be fraught with grave consequences." I tried various expedients to cheer her up. I read novels to her. I had the hands on the place come up in the evening and serenade her with plantation songs. Friends came in sometimes and talked, and frequent letters from the North kept her in touch with her former home. But nothing seemed to rouse her from the depression into which she had fallen. One pleasant afternoon in spring, I placed an armchair in a shaded portion of the front piazza, and, filling it with pillows, led my wife out of the house and seated her where she would have the pleasantest view of a somewhat monotonous scenery. She was scarcely placed when old Julius came through the yard, and, taking off his tattered straw hat, inquired somewhat anxiously, "How is you feelin' dis atternoon, ma'am?" "She is not very cheerful, Julius," I said. My wife was apparently without energy enough to speak for herself. The old man did not seem inclined to go away, so I asked him to sit down. I had noticed, as he came up, that he held some small object in his hand. When he had taken his seat on the top step, he kept fingering this object. What it was I could not quite make out. "What is that you have there, Julius?" I asked with mild curiosity. "Dis is my rabbit foot, suh." This was at a time before this curious superstition had attained its present jocular popularity among white people, and, while I had heard of it before, it had not yet outgrown the charm of novelty. "What do you do with it?" "I kyars it wid me fer luck, suh." "Julius," I observed half to him and half to my wife, "your people will never rise in the world until they throw off these childish superstitions and learn to live by the light of reason and common sense. How absurd to imagine that the forefoot of a poor dead rabbit, with which he timorously felt his way along through a life surrounded by snares and pitfalls, beset by enemies on every hand, can promote happiness or success, or ward off failure or misfortune." "It is ridiculous," assented my wife with faint interest. "Dat's w'at I tells dese niggers roun' here," said Julius. "De foot ain' got no power. It has ter be de hind foot, suh. De lef hind foot er a grabeyard rabbit killt by a cross-eyed nigger on a dark night in de full er de moon." "They must be very rare and valuable," I said. "Dey is kinder skace, suh, en dey ain' no 'mount er money could buy mine, suh. I might len' it ter anybody I saw stop by, but I wouldn' sell it. No, indeed, suh, I wouldn'." "How do you know it brings good luck?" I asked. "'Ca'se I ain' had no bad luck sence I had it, suh, en I's had dis rabbit foot fer 40 years. I had a good marster befo' de wah, en I wa'n't sol' away, en I wuz sot free, en dat is all good luck." "But that doesn't prove anything," I rejoined. "Many other people have gone through a similar experience, and probably more than one of them had no rabbit's foot." "Law, suh, you doan have ter prove 'bout de rabbit foot. Eve'ybody knows dat. Leastways, everybody round here knows it. But if it has to be proved to folks what wasn't born and raised in this neighborhood, there is a easy way to prove it. Is I ever told you the tale of Sis Becky and a Pickaninny?" "No," I said. "Let us hear it." I thought perhaps the story might interest my wife as much or more than the novel I had meant to read from. "Dis yer Becky," Julius began, "used to belong to old Colonel Pen'leton, who owned a plantation down on the Wim'l'ton Road, 'bout 10 miles from here, jest before you gits to Black Swamp. Dis yer Becky was a fiel' hand, en a monst'us good 'un. She had a husban' oncet, a nigger w'at belonged to the nex' plantation. But de man w'at owned her husban' died, en his lan' en his niggers had ter be sole fer ter pay his debts. Colonel Pen'leton 'lowed he'd 'a' bought dis nigger, but he had be'n bettin' on hoss races, en didn' have no money, en so Becky's husban' was sole away ter Ferginny. Co'se Becky went on some 'bout losin' her man, but she couldn't help herse'f, en 'sides dat, she had a Pickaninny fer ter comfo't her. Dis yer little Mose wuz de cutetes', blackest, shiny eyedest little nigger you eber laid eyes on, en he wuz ez fon' er his mammy ez his mammy wuz er him. Co'se Becky had ter wuk, en didn' have much time ter was'e wid her baby. Ole Aun' Nancy, de plantation nuss down at de quarters, used ter take keer of little Mose in de daytime, en atter de niggers come in fum de cotton fiel', Becky 'ud git her chile en kiss 'im en nuss 'im en keep 'im till mawnin', en on Sundays she'd have 'im in de cabin wid her all day long. Sis Becky had got sorter use' ter gittin' 'long widout her husban', when one day Colonel Pen'leton went ter de races. Co'se, w'en he went ter de races, he tuk his hosses, en co'se he bet on his own hosses, en co'se he los' his money, fer Colonel Pen'leton didn' neber have no luck wid his hosses, ef he did keep hisse'f po' projeckin' wid 'em. But dis time dere wuz a hoss name' Lightnin' Bug, w'at belonged ter anudder man, en dis hoss won de sweepstakes, en Colonel Pen'leton tuk a likin' ter dat hoss, en ax' his owner w'at he wuz willin' ter take fer 'im. 'I'll take $1,000 fer dat hoss,' sez dis yer man, who had a big plantation down to'ds Wim'l'ton, where he raised hosses fer ter race en ter sell. Well, Colonel Pen'leton scratch his head, en wonder whar he wuz gwine ter raise $1,000, en he didn' see des how he could do it, fer he owed ez much ez he could borrow already on de skiantity he could gib. But he wuz des boun' ter hab dat hoss, so sez he, 'I'll gib you my note fer $1,100 fer dat hoss.' De other man shuck his head, en sezee, 'Yo' note, suh, is better'n gold, I don't doubt, but I has made it a rule in my business not ter take no notes from nobody. Howsomeber, suh, ef you is kinder short er funds, mos' likely we kin make some kinder bargain. En w'iles we is talkin', I might's well say dat I needs anudder good nigger down on my place. Ef you is got a good one ter spare, I might trade wid you.' Now, Colonel Pen'leton didn' r'ally have no niggers fer ter spare, but he 'lowed ter hisse'f he wuz des bleedst ter hab dat hoss, en so he sez he, 'Well, I don't lack ter, but I reckon I'll hafter. You come out ter my plantation termorrer en look ober my niggers, en pick out de one you wants.' So, sho' 'nuff, nex' day dis yer man come out ter Colonel Pen'leton's place, en rid roun' de plantation en glanced at de niggers, en who should he pick out fum 'em all but Sis Becky. 'I needs a new nigger woman down ter my place,' sez he, 'fer ter cook en wash en so on, en dat young woman 'll des fill de bill. You gimme her, en you kin hab Lightnin' Bug.' Now, Colonel Pen'leton didn' lack ter trade Sis Becky, 'ca'se she wuz nigh 'bout de bes' fiel' han' he had, en 'sides, Mars Colonel didn' keer ter take de mammies 'way fum dey child'n w'iles dey child'n wuz little. But dis man say he want Becky, er else Colonel Pen'leton couldn't have de race hoss. 'Well,' sez de Colonel, 'you kin hab de 'oman, but I don't lack ter sen' her away fum her baby. W'at'll you gimme fer dat nigger baby?' 'I don't want de baby,' sez de other man. 'I ain' got no use fer dat baby.' 'I'll tell you w'at I'll do,' 'lows Colonel Pen'leton. 'I'll th'ow dat Pickaninny in fer good measure.' But de other man shuck his head. 'No,' sez he, 'I's much obleeged, but I don't raise niggers. I raise hosses, and I don't want to be bothered with no nigger babies. Never mind the baby. I'll keep that woman so busy she'll forget the baby, for niggers is made to work, and they ain't got no time for no such foolishness as babies." Colonel Pendleton didn't want to hurt Becky's feelings, for Colonel Pendleton was a kind-hearted man, and never lacked to make no trouble for nobody, and so he told Becky he was going to send her down to Robeson County for a day or so to help out his son-in-law in his work, and being as this other man was going that way, he had asked him to take her along in his buggy. "Can I carry little Mose with me, massa?" asked Sis Becky. "No," says the colonel, as if he was studying whether to let her take him or no. "I reckon you better let Aunt Nancy look after your baby for the day or two you'll be gone, and she'll see that he gets enough to eat till you gets back." So Sis Becky hugged and kissed little Mose, and told him to be a good little pickaninny and take care of hisself, and not forget his mammy while she was gone. And little Mose put his arms around his mammy and laughed and crowed just like it was monstrous fine fun for his mammy to go away and leave him. Well, this here hoss trader started out with Becky, and by, after they'd gone down the Lumberton road for a few miles or so, this man turned round in a different direction, and kept going that way, till by Sis Becky up and asked him if he was going to Robeson County by a new road. "Nah, nigger," says he, "I ain't going to Robeson County at all. I's going to Bladen County, where my plantation is, and where I raises all my hosses." "But how is I going to get to Miss Laura's plantation down in Robeson County?" says Becky, with her heart in her mouth, for she commenced to get skeered all of a sudden. "You ain't going to get there at all," says the man. "You belongs to me now, for I done traded my best race hoss for you, with your old massa. If you's a good gal, I'll treat you right, and if you don't behave yourself, why, what else happens 'll be your own fault." 'Course Sis Becky cried and went on about a pickaninny, but 'course it didn't do no good, and by they got down to this yer man's place, and he put Sis Becky to work, and forgot all about her having a pickaninny. Meanwhiles, when evening come, the day Sis Becky was took away, little Mose commenced to get restless, and by, when his mammy didn't come, he started to cry for her. Aunt Nancy fed him and rocked him, and finally he just cried and cried till he cried himself to sleep. The next day he didn't 'pear to be as peart as usual, and when night come he fretted and went on worse'n he did the night befo'. The next day his little eyes commenced to lose dey shine, and he wouldn't eat nuffin, and he commenced to look so peaked dat Aunt Nancy took and carried him up to the big house and showed him to her ole missus, and her ole missus gun her some medicine for him, and 'lowed if he didn't get no better she should fetch him up to the big house again, and dey'd have a doctor and nurse little Mose up dere, for Aunt Nancy's ole missus 'lowed he was a lackly little nigger and wuth raisin'. But Aunt Nancy had learnt to like little Mose, and she didn't want to have him took up to the big house, and so when he didn't get no better, she gathered a mess of green peas and took the peas and the baby and went to see ole Aunt Peggy, the Conjure Woman down by the Wimbledon road. She gun Aunt Peggy the mess of peas and told her about Sis Becky and little Mose. "Dat is a monstrous small mess of peas you is fotch me," says Aunt Peggy, says she. "Yes, I knows," 'lowed Aunt Nancy, "but dis yer's a monstrous small pickaninny." "You'll have to fetch me somethin' mo'," says Aunt Peggy, "for you can't 'spect me to waste my time diggin' roots and workin' conju'ation for nuffin." "All right," says Aunt Nancy, "I'll fetch you somethin' mo' nex' time." "You better," says Aunt Peggy, "er else dere'll be trouble. What dis yer little pickaninny needs is to see his mammy. You leave 'im here dis evenin', and I'll show 'im his mammy." So when Aunt Nancy had gone away, Aunt Peggy took and worked her roots, and turned little Mose to a hummin' bird, and sot him off fer to find his mammy. So little Mose flewed and flewed and flewed away, till by he got to the place where Sis Becky belonged. He seed his mammy workin' roun' the yard, and he could tell from lookin' at her dat she was troubled in her mind 'bout somethin', and feelin' kinder po'ly. Sis Becky heared somethin' hummin' roun' and roun' her, sweet and low. First she 'lowed it was a hummin' bird, then she thought it sounded like a little Mose croonin' on her breast, way back yonner on the ole plantation. And she jes' imagined it was a little Mose, and it made her feel better, and she went on 'bout her work pearter'n she'd done sence she'd be'n down dere. Little Mose stayed roun' till late in the evenin', and den flewed back as hard as he could ter Aun' Peggy. As fer Sis' Becky, she drempt all dat night dat she wuz holdin' her pickaninny in her arms, and kissin' him and nussin' him, des lack she used ter do back on the ole plantation where he wuz born. En fer 3 or 4 days Sis' Becky went 'bout her work wid mo' spirit dan she'd showed sence she'd be'n down dere ter dis man's plantation. De nex' day atter he come back, little Mose wuz mo' pearter en better'n he had be'n fer a long time. But to'ds de een' er de week he 'mence' ter git restless ag'in, en stop eatin', en Aun' Nancy kyar'd him down ter Aun' Peggy once mo', en she turnt him to a mockin' bird dis time, en sont him off ter see his mammy ag'in. It didn' take him long fer ter git dere, en w'en he did, he seed his mammy standin' in de kitchen lookin' back in de direction little Mose wuz comin' fum, en dey wuz tears in her eyes, en she looked mo' po'ly en peaked 'n she had w'en he wuz down dere befo'. So little Mose sot on a tree in de yard en sung en sung en sung, des fittin' ter split his throat. Fus' Sis' Becky didn' notice 'im much, but dis mockin' bird kep' stayin' roun' de house all day, en bimeby Sis' Becky des 'magined dat mockin' bird wuz her little Mose, crowin' en crowin', des lack he useter do w'en his mammy would come home at night fum de cotton fiel'. De mockin' bird stayed roun' dere mos' all day, en w'en Sis' Becky went out in de yard one time, dis yer mockin' bird lit on her shoulder en peck at de piece er bread she wuz eatin', en fluttered his wings so dey rub up agin de side er her head. En w'en he flewed away 'long late in de evenin', des 'fo' sundown, Sis' Becky felt mo' better'n she had sence she had heared dat hummin' bird a week er so pas', en dat night she dremp 'bout ole times ag'in, des lack she did befo'. But dis yer totin' little Mose down to ole Aun' Peggy, en dis yer gittin' things fer ter pay de Conjure Woman use up a lot er Aun' Nancy's time, en she begun ter git kinder tired. 'Sides dat, w'en Sis' Becky had be'n on de plantation, she had use' ter help Aun' Nancy wid de young'uns evenin's en Sundays. En Aun' Nancy commenced ter miss her monst'us, 'specially sence she got a tech er de rheumatiz herse'f, en so she 'lows ter ole Aun' Peggy one day, 'Aun' Peggy, ain't dey no way you kin fetch Sis' Becky back home?' 'Huh!' says Aun' Peggy, 'I don' know 'bout dat. I'll hafter wuk my roots en fin' out whether I can er no, but it'll take a monst'us heap er wuk, en I can't was'e my time fer nuffin. Ef you'll fetch me sump'n ter pay me fer my trouble, I reckon we kin fix it.' So nex' day Aun' Nancy went down ter see Aun' Peggy ag'in. 'Aun' Peggy,' says she, 'I has fotch you my bes' Sunday head handkercher. Will dat do?' Aun' Peggy look' at de head handkercher, en run her hand ober it, en says she, 'Yes, dat'll do fus' rate. I's be'n wukkin' my roots sence you be'n gone, en I 'lows mos' lackly I kin git Sis' Becky back, but it's gwine take fig'rin' en studyin' ez well ez conj'in'. De fus' thing ter do'll be ter stop fetchin' dat pickaninny down here, en not sen' 'im ter see his mammy no mo'. Ef he gits too po'ly, you lemme know, en I'll gib you some kin' er mixtry fer ter make 'im fergit Sis' Becky fer a week er so. So less'n you comes fer dat, you needn't ter come back ter see me no mo' till I sends fer you.' So Aun' Peggy sont Aun' Nancy away, en de fus' thing she done wuz ter call a hornet fum her nes' under her eaves. 'You go up ter Kunnel Pen'leton's stable, Hornet,' says she, 'en sting de knees er de race hoss name' Lightnin' Bug. Be sho' en git de right one.' So de hornet flewed up ter Kunnel Pen'leton's stable en stung Lightnin' Bug roun' de legs, en de nex' mawnin' Lightnin' Bug's knees wuz all swole up, twicet ez big ez dey oughter be. W'en Kunnel Pen'leton went out ter de stable en see de hoss's legs, it would 'a' des made you trimble like a leaf fer ter hear him cuss dat hoss trader. Howsomeber, he cool off bimeby, en tole de stable boy fer ter rub Lightnin' Bug's legs wid some liniment. De boy done ez his marster tole 'im, en by de nex' day de swellin' had gone down consid'able. Aun' Peggy had sont a sparrer w'at had her nes' in one er de trees close ter her cabin fer ter watch w'at wuz gwine on roun' de big house, En w'en dis yer sparrer tole her de hoss wuz gittin' ober de swellin', she sont de hornet back fer ter sting his knee some mo', en de nex' mawnin' Lightnin' Bug's legs wuz swole up wuss'n dan befo'. Well, dis time Kunnel Pen'leton wuz mad th'ough en th'ough, en all de way 'roun', en he cussed dat hoss trader up en down, fum A ter Izzard. He cussed so hard dat de stable boy got mos' scared ter deff, en went off en hid hisse'f in de hay. Ez fer Kunnel Pen'leton, he went right up ter de house, en got out his pen en ink, en tuk off his coat, en roll up his sleeves, en writ a letter ter dis yer hoss trader, en sezee, 'You is sol' me a hoss w'at is got a ring bone er a spavin er sump'n, en w'at I paid you fer wuz a soun' hoss. I want you ter sen' my nigger 'oman back, en take yo' ole hoss, er e'se I'll sue you sho's you bawn.' But dis yer man wa'n't skeered a bit, en he writ back ter Kunnel Pen'leton dat a bargain wuz a bargain, dat Lightnin' Bug wuz soun' w'en he sol' 'im, en ef Kunnel Pen'leton didn't knowed enough about hosses to take keer of a fine racer, dat wuz his own funeral, en dey say Kunnel Pen'leton kin sue en be cussed fer all he keer, but he ain't gwine ter give up de nigger he bought en paid fer." W'en Kunnel Pen'leton got dis letter, he wuz mad'n he wuz befo', 'specially 'cause de man 'lowed he didn't know how ter take keer of fine hosses. But he couldn't do nuffin but fetch a lawsuit, en he knowed by his own 'sperience dat lawsuits wuz slow ez a 7-year itch, en cos' mo' d'n dey come ter, en he 'lowed he better go slow en wait a w'ile. Aun' Peggy knowed w'at wuz gwine on all dis time, en she fix' up a little bag wid some roots en one thing er anudder in it, en gun it ter dis sparrer er her'n, en tole 'im ter take it way down yonder whar Sis Becky wuz, en drap it right befo' de do' er her cabin, so she'd be sho' en fin' it de fus time she come out'n de do'. One night Sis Becky dreamt her pickaninny wuz dead, en de nex' day she wuz moanin' en groanin' all day. She dreamt de same dream 3 nights runnin', en den, de nex' mawnin' atter de las' night, she foun' dis yer little bag de sparrer had drap' in front er her do', en she 'lowed she'd be'n conjured, en wuz gwine ter die, en ez long ez her pickaninny wuz dead, dey wa'n't no use tryin' ter do nuffin nohow. En so she tuk en went ter bed, en tole her marster she'd be'n conjured, en wuz gwine ter die. Her marster laughed at her, en argy'd wid her, en tried ter 'suade her out er dis yer fool notion, ez he called it, fer he wuz one er dese yer w'ite folks w'at p'ten' dey don't b'lieve in conjurin', but it wa'n't no use. Sis Becky kep' gittin' wusser en wusser, 'tel fin'ly dis yer man 'lowed Sis Becky wuz gwine ter die sho' 'nuff, en ez he knowed dey hadn't be'n nuffin de matter wid Lightnin' Bug w'en he traded 'im, he 'lowed maybe he could kyore 'im en fetch 'im roun' all right, leas'ways good 'nuff ter sell ag'in. En anyhow, a lame hoss wuz better'n a dead nigger. So he set down en writ Kunnel Pen'leton a letter. "My conscience," sezee, "has been troublin' me 'bout dat ring bone hoss I sol' you. Some folks 'lows a hoss trader ain' got no conscience, but dey don't know me, fer dat is my weak spot, en de reason I ain' made no mo' money hoss tradin'. Fac' is," sezee, "I's got so I can't sleep nights fum studyin' 'bout dat spavin' hoss, en I's made up my min' dat w'iles a bargain is a bargain, en you seed Lightnin' Bug befo' you traded fer 'im, principle is wuth mo' d'n money, er hosses, er niggers. So ef you'll sen' Lightnin' Bug down here, I'll sen' yo' nigger 'oman back, en we'll call de trade off, en be ez good frien's ez we eber wuz, en no hard feelin's." So, sho' 'nuff, Kunnel Pen'leton sont de hoss back, en w'en de man w'at come ter bring Lightnin' Bug tole Sis Becky her pickaninny wa'n't dead, Sis Becky wuz so glad dat she 'lowed she wuz gwine ter try ter live 'tel she got back whar she could see little Mose once mo'. En w'en she retch de ole plantation en seed her baby kickin' en crowin' en holdin' out his little arms to'ds her, she wush she wa'n't conjured en didn't have ter die. En w'en Aun' Nancy tole her all about Aun' Peggy, Sis Becky went down ter see de Conjure Woman, en Aun' Peggy tole her she had conjured her. En den Aun' Peggy tuk de goopher off'n her, en she got well, en stayed on de plantation, en raise' her pickaninny. En w'en little Mose growed up, he could sing en whistle des like a mockin' bird, so dat de w'ite folks useter hab 'im come up ter de big house at night, en whistle en sing fer 'im, en dey useter give 'im money en vittles en one thing er anudder, w'ich he alluz tuk home to his mammy. for he knowed all 'bout what she had gone through. He turnt out to be a smart man, and learnt de blacksmith trade, and Colonel Pen'leton let him high his time. En bimeby he bought his mammy and sot her free, en den he bought hisse'f and took care of Sis' Becky as long as dey both libbed." My wife had listened to this story with greater interest than she had manifested in any subject for several days. I had watched her furtively from time to time during the recital, and had observed the play of her countenance. It had expressed in turn sympathy, indignation, pity, and, at the end, lively satisfaction. "That is a very ingenious fairy tale, Julius," I said, "and we are much obliged to you." "Why, John," said my wife severely, "the story bears the stamp of truth, if ever a story did." "Yes," I replied, "especially the humming bird episode and the mocking bird digression, to say nothing of the doings of the hornet and the sparrow." "Oh, well, I don't care," she rejoined, with delightful animation. "Those are mere ornamental details, and not at all essential. The story is true to nature, and might have happened half a hundred times, and no doubt did happen in those horrid days before the war." "By the way, Julius," I remarked, "your story doesn't establish what you started out to prove, that a rabbit's foot brings good luck." "It's plain 'nuff ter me, suh," replied Julius. "I bet young missis dere kin 'splain it herse'f." "I rather suspect," replied my wife promptly, "that Sis' Becky had no rabbit's foot." "You is hit de bull's eye de fus' fire, ma'am," assented Julius. "Ef Sis' Becky had had a rabbit foot, she neber would 'a' went th'ough all dis trouble." I went into the house for some purpose, and left Julius talking to my wife. When I came back a moment later he was gone. My wife's condition took a turn for the better from this very day, and she was soon on the way to ultimate recovery. Several weeks later, after she had resumed her afternoon drives, which had been interrupted by her illness, Julius brought the rockaway round to the front door one day, and I assisted my wife into the carriage. "John," she said before I had taken my seat, "I wish you would look in my room and bring me my handkerchief. You will find it in the pocket of my blue dress." I went to execute the commission. When I pulled the handkerchief out of her pocket, something else came with it and fell on the floor. I picked up the object and looked at it. It was Julius's rabbit's foot. End of Sis Becky's Pickaninny. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista.